righty. Well, we are live talking about Iowa and covering the Iowa caucuses. Welcome to Forge and Anvil, where we hammer out uncomfortable conversations about culture, theology, and politics to sharpen ourselves for the race set before us. My name is Connor. I'm host of this podcast. I am a husband, a father, and a follower of Christ, doing my best to represent him well each day. I'm joined by two amazing guests tonight, the first of which is a first-time guest, William Wolfe. So, William, go ahead and introduce yourself to our audience and let us know a little bit about you.
Yeah, Connor, thank you so much for having me on here tonight. Great to meet you and be on the show. Love the name, Forged and Anvil. That's great. My name is William Wolfe. I have a history of working in politics, spent 10 years in D.C., working for 3 different members of Congress. I worked at a political action arm of the Heritage Foundation, Heritage Action for America. And then I did 4 years as a political appointee in the Trump administration at the State Department and the DOD. After I finished my time in politics, I took a rather unusual turn and went to seminary, finished my MDiv at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. And I've since moved back to Charlotte, North Carolina, and I'm working on a lot of things. Some will be public here very soon.
Awesome. Well, welcome. Appreciate you joining us. And back again is my fill-in co-host, because Michael is out. So I've got Will Spencer from Renaissance of Men. So Will, same task. Say hi.
William, it's nice to meet you. Connor, thanks for having me back. My name's Will Spencer. I'm the host of the Renaissance of Men podcast. And on the show, we talk about theology, masculinity, culture, a little bit of politics, Bitcoin, sovereignty, and families. And I'm also a Christian men's counselor, run men's groups, and somewhat of a troublemaker on social media. You can find me everywhere at Ren of Men.
Great. Well, thanks.
Whereas I am not a troublemaker at all in social media.
No, you're really timid. Very timid. Well, before we get started, be sure to check out last week's episode. We actually had Todd Erzin. He's the co-host of Steve Deace, the Steve Deace Show with The Blaze. And we talked all about the Iowa caucuses. So if you want to see how well that aged, you can go ahead and check it out. So Todd had an interesting prediction. He predicted that Desantis is going to win the caucus. So we'll talk more about that as we go on, but be sure to like and share this video to boost us in the algorithms. We are live on YouTube, Rumble, and X. So if you want to hop over to X, you can go ahead and repost the stream, and it will allow us to be seen by more people. So we really appreciate that. It will show up on the Forge and Anvil Twitter, which the handle is @ForgeandA. Follow us there for additional content and updates on the show. And we really appreciate all of your support. So we'll go ahead and dive straight in here. But right now, they've already got the results coming in for Iowa. And so far, a lot of people are happy. A lot of people are upset because you can see here that they've already called the race for Donald Trump. But there's only 3% of the vote counted. So we've got a whole lot more votes to count. But Trump is already at 52.8%, with Ron DeSantis in second place at 21.4%. Nikki Haley, third place at 17.6%. Vivek Ramaswamy at 7.2%. Ryan Binkley at 23 votes at 0.6%. Asa Hutchinson, you love to see it, at 5 votes, 0.1%. And Chris Christie, 0.08%. Chris Christie's tied with other. So that gives you an idea of how things are going for him right now. So
killing it.
That is where things stand. As of right now, we're going to continue to keep you guys updated on the race as the night goes on. So far, a lot of people in Iowa are really upset because the voting is not even anywhere close to being done, but they're already projecting it for Trump. So, William, I want to go ahead and just start with you and get your overall thoughts on the primary. Obviously, you worked in the Trump administration. I believe you're still supporting him. Maybe go ahead and tell us a little bit about that and what you think is going to happen tonight with Iowa.
Yeah, well, we've over the last few years, really, the political race callers have started calling things really early. I mean, Fox News in particular has taken heat for this, right? It's like Fox News calls the 2024 presidential race already, things like that. And so, look, it's only 3% of the votes in so far, but Trump has a commanding lead as it stands. He's over 50%. Personally, I'm not surprised. My main contention, and one of the main reasons that you haven't seen me really engaging in the back and forth of the primary fights on social media, I've really stayed out of it, is because my fundamental contention that there's no real primary, that Trump is going to sweep through and he will be the GOP nominee in 2024. And I think that this first in the nation Iowa caucus is showing that. Now, look, winning Iowa isn't everything. Ted Cruz won Iowa in 2016. Right. And so, we've got other states to move on to, but I think this continues to show us that Trump has a significant lock on the Republican primary and general election voting base.
Yeah, and you're right. Ted Cruz was the winner of Iowa back in 2016, and Iowa's been a bit of a dark horse as far as picking candidates. They oftentimes pick people that, previously, several cycles back, Iowa kind of was the predictor for who was going to win, but in recent times it has not been. Iowa is kind of their own. They're their own beast, and they will pick whoever they want. And it's interesting. That's exactly why Todd Erzin was predicting that Ron DeSantis was going to win. Now, of course, we're not anywhere near there yet, but we'll see what happens as the night goes on. Only 3% of the votes counted. But why do you think that, William, why do you think that Fox News called it so early? Why do you think that that's becoming a recent trend of these outlets immediately calling the races as the polls close?
Yeah, well, one of the things I'm not a professional pollster by any means. So one of the things could simply be it's due to advanced technology. As technology has gotten better, they have a better chance of predicting the outcomes, particularly as they look, precinct by precinct, county by county. But also, I think they like to add to the political drama. I mean, Donald Trump is nothing if not news ratings for all these outlets, right? So CNN gets to sort of cope and seethe and have meltdown all night long now that they've called it for Donald Trump, and every other outlet can follow in their footsteps. There really is a symbiotic or perhaps even parasitic relationship between Donald Trump and the news media. They love to hate him, and they love the ratings that they get from him. And there's a lot of critical analysis that could be applied to that. I'm just sort of stating it as I see it. So like you said, though, a lot more to come in.
Yeah. So you spent time in the Trump administration. Obviously, you served all 4 years. So what was that like? Tell us a little bit about maybe how you got involved in the first place, how you were selected to have that role, and then tell us a little bit about what the day-to-day was like for those who are kind of unaware of how that works.
Yeah, so I had the opportunity to volunteer on the Presidential Transition Organization that kicked off shortly after the election in November. That's a volunteer position that I did, nights and weekends for the chance to get my foot in the door. That was sort of the attitude I always brought to my work in D.C. When I first got to D.C., I waited tables nights and weekends while I was an unpaid intern on Capitol Hill, hustling for that first job. And so I did that. And by doing that, I was able to get my name on a list as a potential presidential political appointee. And then really, I mean, it's no joke in Washington, D.C. It's not necessarily what you know, it's who you know. But one of my good friends was tapped to be Secretary of State Tillerson's speechwriter. He was the first Secretary of State in the Trump administration. And he knew the Assistant Secretary of Legislative Affairs at the time and knew that she needed help, particularly managing the House side of the Legislative Affairs portfolio versus the Senate side. I'm a House guy. I love the rancor and the raucous of the lower house. And so I was able to, get interviewed, go through the clearance process, and I started in April. So not quite 4 years. I did 45 months for 45. And so was able to come in and help sort of build out that Leg Affairs shop for the Trump administration in the State Department. And that was really ground zero of the deep state in many ways. And the gears of that bureaucracy just continued to grind against Trump, from day one to the very final day against Tillerson, against Pompeo. And so it was a really difficult work environment working with career civil servants and career foreign service officers who were anticipating the coronation of Hillary Clinton, who had previously served as Secretary of State. So State Department in particular was just absolutely gutted that they did not get their pick in the White House. I remember my early weeks in every office and bureau at State Department or every other federal agency, there's only a very thin layer of political appointees. The vast majority are career bureaucrats. And so people in other offices don't always know which one's a career, which one's a political. Some of my early trips to Capitol Hill, taking senior, State Department officials up, I'm sitting in the back of these 15 passenger vans, and I'm listening to these officials plot how they're going to communicate to Congress in such a way as to undermine the imperatives of the Trump administration, right out of the gate. And that just was rampant all through my time at State and continued on at DOD. So the opposition to Trump from the entrenched bureaucracy was fierce and severe. And that's something that whoever the next Republican administration, next Republican president is going to have to seriously deal with that.
So do you think that Trump, if he ends up getting the nominee, which it seems like it's very likely, of course, he's definitely the front runner. Do you think that Trump has learned a lot of lessons about personnel and things like that? Because obviously that's a lot of the things that people gripe about him is his personnel choices. People like John Bolton. So do you think that Trump's learned his lessons, and do you think that we're going to see a more tactical approach towards getting the deep state?
Well, hope springs eternal, and I would like to think that after 4 years of Russian collusion, hoax, nonsense, fake impeachments, leaks all across the administration, former administration officials lying under oath to try to implicate Trump in the January 6th proceedings. I would hope he's learned a lesson. One of the other issues here, Will and Connor, is that the pipeline of committed conservative and sort of populist reform-minded Republican staffers is pretty thin, to which I'd like to give a shout out to the good guys over at American Moment. They're doing an excellent job along with Heritage and Project 2025 to build out a Rolodex of serious staffers who could come in as political appointees and actually work to advance the president's agenda and not to subvert it. So you got sort of a both and there going on, but I do think he's learned his lesson. One of the main ways I think we can see this in the Schedule F policy proposals that he has out there to sort of reclassify career bureaucrats and give the president more discretion in dismissing or reassigning those who he understands to not be, serving at his will. I mean, that's what the executive officer of the United States is supposed to do when they assume the role of the chief executive officer in the presidency. Everybody serves at the will of the president, except for some very few scattered positions that are appointed by commissions, et cetera. And so this is something that's critical to the health of our democracy, to use that term, that the duly elected president of the United States is being served to advance the agenda on which he ran and was elected, and not worked against at every single executive branch agency. So I do think the fire's in Trump's belly to tackle those reforms. It'll be met with fierce opposition and potentially court battles, but I think he's got the right instincts for it this time around. And I have a lot of confidence in some of the people that I know who would be positioned with him this time around to execute this agenda.
Well, you kind of already answered this, but I am Ungit is in the chat over on Rumble. He said, will Trump do better with his hires this time around? Was his head fake about picking Nikki Haley a bad sign? Yeah, what's your thoughts on Nikki Haley?
Well, look, I think picking her would be a disaster, right? So, like, I don't work for the Trump campaign, but if I was advising President Trump, I would say, stay away, stay far, far away. Nikki Haley is, I think, emblematic of everything that's wrong with a failed neocon GOP establishment that essentially ran the party until Trump disrupted it in 2016. And to bring somebody like that back in, particularly into the vice presidential position, which, oversees a lot of the agencies day to day. And she would certainly have a strong hand in foreign policy with the National Security Council and at the Defense Department, the State Department, CIA. And we don't want her foreign policy anywhere near a second Trump term. So I think it'd be a terrible pick. And I'm not at all one of those people who, if Trump actually were to pick her, somehow I'd work my way around to say this is some 4D chess brilliant move. No, I think it'd be a bad move. I'm saying it now. If he hears it, President Trump, don't pick Nikki Haley.
Yeah. I think if he did pick Nikki Haley, I'd be tempted to completely sit out the general. It's unfortunate, but I've said it before. I said it last week that I think if he were to pick Nikki Haley, we'd be potentially looking at a JFK LBJ situation. And I hope not, obviously, but I could definitely see, especially if you've read, there's a great book, Age of Entitlement by Christopher Caldwell. I mean, it really just goes through the whole movement of the 60s and everything that happened after JFK with LBJ and the Great Society Act and all this stuff. I mean, I really think that Nikki Haley is definitely the establishment pick. In fact, a lot of people, I know Vivek has been talking about how he believes that Nikki Haley is actually their pick, potentially even over Joe Biden. I think that they know that Joe Biden's unpopular, and they're hoping that she can maybe be number 2 in the primary. Trump potentially gets eliminated from the ballots due to all these indictments, and then she would end up basically being crowned the winner, because it's not so much about Republican Democrat. It's much more about uniparty versus the people. So what are your guys' thoughts on that?
If I could just jump in real quick, I think that's probably the thing that concerns me the most is that the battle, the battle for any one candidate in a normal political scenario is his party and his coalition within his party against the other party, right? The split is it's a feature, not a bug necessarily. But with Trump, it feels very much like his agenda would be almost against the overwhelming opposition of so much of America, of both parties and all persuasions. And I guess the big question that I'm going into 2024 with is, can I realistically expect any candidate to have the will or intention to meaningfully improve my life, or will it just be a question about who will prevent things from getting worse, right? Or who will slow down the slide? And that's my honest question. That's not necessarily a question about any candidate specifically, but it seems so much that the way that America is set up now with the institutional capture is that the momentum towards, I don't know, civilizational collapse at the extreme end, let's say, is so intense that how can any one candidate begin to turn the ship around? And so that's kind of the question that I have. And I think it's a legitimate one, especially because like I'm making plans to just kind of do it. And many of my friends are making plans. We're just going to kind of do this on our own because we think the ship of state has sailed away from us. So I'm curious to get your thoughts about that, William, and Connor as well.
Yeah, that's a legitimate concern. I mean, look, I do in general buy into the meme that nobody's coming to save you, right? So like, personal responsibility and initiative is critical, particularly in young men, men with families across America right now. And we should be trying to build resilient and anti-fragile communities at the local level, wherever we are, regardless of national elections. But when it comes to the question of like, would a second Trump term materially improve our lives? Well, to that, I would just have to look to the first one, which it certainly did. I mean, even, 18 months into Trump's first term, you had all these Clinton voters going around whispering and saying like, well, my 401k is doing better than ever. Gas prices are down. Groceries are more affordable. And so I'd say that there was a material improvement in the basic living conditions and for the American people. And that goes for everybody. I mean, this is one of the things that often is trotted out by, the Democrats that, Republicans are only looking out for the 1%. But the reality is that during Trump's administration, living conditions materially improved for everybody, whether you're African-American, Hispanic, lower class, middle class. In fact, the lower middle classes were often most improved. And this was, reflected in the fact that Donald Trump, he ticked up in his support for minority communities in 2020, even compared to 2016. But that said, in regards to what you're saying, Will, about the acceleration of the demise of, the regime and just American life in general, here's what's one of the problems is that when the Democrats get into office, they get to go 100 miles per hour in the direction they're headed. And again, going back to what I was saying about the way the federal bureaucracy and Congress works right now is when a Republican manages to get in, they get to go, 5 to 10 miles per hour at best. And so to really break that system and to accelerate towards, sort of a renewed American era, it's going to look like chaos, and it's going to be met with extreme resistance, accusations of dictatorship, anarchy, unconstitutional this, unconstitutional that. And so again, we need to have the spine and the fortitude to withstand that. And it will require strong leadership for sure.
Yeah.
So go ahead, Connor. I have a follow-up question to that.
Yeah. Well, to that point, something that you mentioned, you mentioned how you're kind of doing it. A lot of guys that are trying to do it on their own, and I agree with what William was saying about we need anti-fragile communities at the local level, but at the same time, to William's point earlier, guys like American Moment and those individuals, they are creating a list of people that could be staffed by Trump or whoever ends up being the GOP nominee. So that the day one, they actually have a large group of loyalists who are able to be appointed to actually be able to further the agenda. So, all that to say, Will, I think that you're right. That no politician is going to ultimately be ultimately going to be a savior for our country. But what's beautiful about people like American Moment is they are actually creating a list of people. So it's not just hanging on one man. It's an actual group of individuals that are actually making a concerted effort to actually turn the ship around. And I mean, I've been saying this for a long time. I think that we've actually seen a lot of great things happening in the country. I'm actually fairly white-pilled. I think that there's been a lot of beautiful discipleship happening at the ground level. And in my mind, I just want to get someone in the White House that can buy us more time so that we can actually see the fruit of those things take place. Because I truly think that it's going to take decades for this culture to fully turn around. But if we keep having presidents like Joe Biden, our country won't have decades. So that's the way I feel about it.
So I guess my follow-up question is, do we think collectively that a Republican presidential candidate will put forth an actual vision of how they want things to be? Because I think that's part of the challenge that America is facing right now, is no one is really willing to put forth a vision of what America could be in the sunlight. So for example, the Democrats don't actually put forth a vision, right? They can't actually say what they're trying to turn America into in the sunlight, because then no one would buy it. They guilt and they shame and they accuse and they point fingers and they talk about victimhood ideology, and people capitulate to that because they have, soft hearts and perhaps lack of spine. But it seems like in that vacuum, it would be more than desirable for a Republican candidate to put forth a vision. This is the actual direction that I want to take America in, an affirmative, positive vision. That's why, I don't intend to create a discussion about this unless you guys want to. That's why I enjoyed Stephen Wolfe's book, your brother, William, The Case for Christian Nationalism, is that at least whatever disagreements people may have with his methodology for arriving at the conclusions that he did is separate. At least he put forth an affirmative vision, a positive vision of how things could work. So do you see Trump putting forth like, this is the America that I'm trying to build, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead? Or is it going to be a constant war against the woke, which are two separate things?
Yeah, so I hear what you're saying, and I think that I would maybe quibble with the framing a little bit, because
Sure.
I was on this very interesting Twitter space panel where I was being accused of just being a reactionary and not having like a positive vision. Short of what you're saying, to which I say that if you're getting pummeled in the face, you have to react, and the positive vision in that moment of time is neutralizing your adversary. That's the positive, and that's the initial positive vision. And so there is that element to it. But one of the things I've always liked about Trump is the guy's been incredibly consistent for decades on about two major policy issues that I actually think sort of speak to a renewed vision of America. And when we think about like a positive vision, the reality is it's not that complicated. What's a positive vision for our country? Not saying necessarily like spiritually, but let's take economically first, right? So like economic independence from China, trade deals that benefit the American people, immigration policies and labor policies that facilitate, natural citizens being able to be prosperous with rising wages to pay for a family, right? So again, the idea of like what's a positive vision for our country is something as simple as a young family working on one wage, being able to afford a house, right? And so when Blake Masters ran for Senate recently, he had that ad where he said, you should be able to live on a single family income in America again. And so there is that interesting element where a lot of it harkens back to times in America where these things were possible, but whether they were, previously possible at a different time in America or they're possible somewhere else now, it's like, that's just sort of a basic standard of life that we should expect and aspire to. And so to circle all the way back around, when it comes to trade and immigration and economic policy, I think Trump has a very positive vision for a country that looks like, renewed American prosperity, decoupling from China and taking that seriously. I mean, the Chinese threat to our economy, to our national security there, I saw today reports of a Chinese billionaire with ties to the Communist Party having purchased, 200 acres of land in New York. That's happening everywhere. And so decoupling from China, bringing the dollar back to a position of strength, you would know much better than I would, but, looking to push forward positively on cryptocurrencies and continuing to make sure that people have financial freedom. I think that those are things that Trump absolutely has a bead on. And so when he ran originally on, Make America Great Again, those are some of the positive things. And then another thing I'd like to touch on briefly, and then I'll tie this up because I could go on for a long time on this, is the idea of sort of a national cultural cohesion. And so when it comes to immigration, a lot of people take umbrage with how Trump talks about illegal aliens, et cetera. But the reality is Trump does have, I think, an instinctual recognition of the necessity for a cohesive national American identity that has been absolutely intentionally fractured by elites of both parties over the last 70 years. And so this is something that I think he gets, and he would seek to restrict immigration, not just the legal immigration, finishing the wall, all those things, but actually tackling legal immigration. Elon Musk is great on free speech, but he's wrong on this. He says all the time, we just stop illegal immigration, but we need as much legal immigration as possible. And I just disagree. I think that's not a positive vision. I don't think Trump shares that. And so, he's talked about favoring Christians in American immigration policy, which I think is something that is totally reasonable and something that we should consider. You shouldn't be able to come to our country if you're not going to be able to assimilate and share and advance the core commitments and values that are expressed in the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and root all the way back to the English common law and the Christian heritage of America. And whether or not, Trump understands it to that minute detail or has probably not read Stephen Wolfe's Case for Christian Nationalism, on those two broad policy buckets, economics, trade, and immigration that ties directly into who we are as a people, as a country, I think he's got a great vision on that. And then when it comes to combating wokeness and the transgender agenda, I think he'll be great on that front as well. So I do have confidence in, there's nothing new under the sun, and the good life, of course, biblically speaking, is one thing, but the proverbial wisdom about what looks like a good life, being able to provide for your family, leave an inheritance to your children. It's not novel, it's not new, and that's what we should be pursuing, to bring in a new American era of prosperity and flourishing and national cohesion.
Yeah, I agree. I think that we need more ownership in the country. You mentioned single income earners being able to afford a house, and currently I'm the only breadwinner in my family, and I've been blessed to be a homeowner. But at the same time, that required my wife and I to move from the Arizona area where Will is at, all the way to Tennessee, where the prices are a whole lot different. The market's a lot different, a lot more favorable, because after COVID, in the Phoenix Valley area, I think house prices shot up by like 40%, something ridiculous like that. And we were saving up to have 20% down, and basically inflation was so intense that our 20% down, we almost were there. We had like probably 18% down of what an average starter home would have been in the Phoenix area. And then inflation hit, and it was like, there's just no way. There's no way we can just double our money overnight and hope that we can afford a house. And it's been shown, wealth building, that home ownership is the number one tool for wealth building. So really, a lot of these Trump policies that you're talking about, William, are ultimately going to allow for future generations to be prosperous, which is ultimately, a beautiful vision for the future in itself.
Yeah, I have friends who are locked in at like 3.2% right now or lower. I think I've got friends locked in under 3% who bought during the first Trump administration, right? Compared to now where rates are at back up to 8%. I've got a little Iowa update if we want to pivot back to that. This
let's
do fascinating thing.
Let's go.
Desantis campaign has released a statement. This looks like it's real. I hope it isn't. I hope it is. I hope it's not fake. It says DeSantis campaign statement on the media's election interference. The DeSantis campaign released the following statement. It is absolutely outrageous that the media would participate in election interference by calling the race before tens of thousands of Iowans even had a chance to vote. The media is in the tank for Trump, and this is the most egregious example yet. Communications Director Andrew Romero. So reactions to that, guys.
Yeah. Go ahead, Will.
Sorry, third place. Like I I guess. Yeah, sure.
Well, I've got a list on Twitter here of different people who are actually on the ground in Iowa giving updates, and a lot of individuals are very upset at how early they called it. So, for example, let me see if I can get this pulled up here.
Yeah, look, and I can
One
understand that. I said that at the start, right? Like it's sort of all of our politics is increasingly becoming this absurd theater, and I could see there being wisdom in waiting to call it later.
Yeah. Steve Dace said, people are telling me phones got Fox News alerts. Trump won before they even voted. Just criminal levels of voter suppression. That network is freaking cancer with friends like Fox. Who needs CNN?
I mean, I think it's probably, given the numbers, you can probably say that it's unfortunate, but to make accusations of like voter suppression and stuff like that, like the numbers, I mean, if these numbers hold even a little bit further, it still comes across as a blowout. So I think it seems a little grasping to me, I think.
Yeah, when did the poll
here's an interesting one.
Go ahead, in Iowa?
So from AJ Spiker, he said, reporting Iowa caucus from Franklin Township, Story County. Ron DeSantis is at 77%, Haley at 74%, Trump at 53%, Vivek at 16%, Asa at 1%. It took 4 calls for a Trump speaker to come forward. Let's hope this is a sign. I'm not sure where Franklin Township is. Story County, I'm going to see how big of a county that is. But yeah, apparently there are multiple reports where supposedly DeSantis is in the lead at some of these counties and some of these caucus locations. So it would be interesting to see if this truly is Fox News just being controlled opposition, to Shara's point. It's really interesting to see whether or not we'll see the results flip overnight as we continue on to actually tally them. Because last I looked, we were still at about 4% of the vote.
Yeah, I mean, it's really, I think, way too early to have called it. And it's not just Fox, it's CNN, it's all of them. And look, Steve Deese is absolutely right about that point. Like with friends like Fox News, who needs enemies, right? I think that's something that's been interesting too, that I've definitely noticed, I'm sure you guys have as well, that Fox News has just they're just moving in a bad direction, right? Like you used to be able to maybe 5-6 years ago say, well, look, you'll at least get a different perspective from Fox than you would from CNN, than you would from MSNBC. But Fox is trending liberal on all the cultural issues for sure. They've lost most of their top talent. And so they, I don't know really what's distinguishing them as a trusted conservative news source these days. So I'm happy to share Steve Deese's frustrations on that. I think Steve is great. He's a brother in Christ and it does great work. We're on different sides of the primary, but I certainly don't hold that against him.
Yeah. I had another one here. Let me share my screen. This is just a thread that I have of a bunch of Iowa people. So Jason Johnson, Fox called the race while the caucus I was monitoring was still listening to speakers. Suddenly everyone started looking at their phones, reading the breaking news. Remarkable. Interesting.
Yeah. So what would this mean? I guess I'm having, like, are they trying to knock DeSantis out? Is this really what would be going on in this case? Like, what's the play here? I agree with everything you're saying about Fox News, by the way. I completely agree, because I live in Phoenix, and so I watched, I think it was Fox's Calling Arizona in 2020. That was like, seems a little fishy, because I live here and I think I know what's actually going on here. So what do you think is going on? Just a media rush?
Yeah, let me think through that for a second. I think first I would say that it's definitely irresponsible to call any race before people have even finished the voting in situations like these. And that's where, while I'm not sure if I would necessarily use terms like election interference or voter suppression, certainly not in the legal sense of those words in any way, but the impact it would have on people who are still making it to the caucus points and still coming to submit. If you're getting ready to roll and you see some news alert that says it's over, that is going to have an impact. Again, at the end of the day, I don't think it'll have a substantial impact on the outcome of this. But it just, as Orrin McIntyre says, you think you hate journalists, but you don't hate them nearly enough. Right. And I think this just goes to show the lack of credibility from the mainstream media outlets, including Fox, what their goal would be in that. I think that Again, as I said at the beginning, that the media loves to have Trump as the candidate. I mean, are they intentionally trying to do this to boost him? Even Fox, I don't know. I really couldn't speak to that, but you could conjecture. What do you guys think?
Yeah. Well, I think as a whole, it's very clear that, to your point earlier, that these mainstream outlets, they thrive on Trump content. So for better or worse, they do have a financial incentive for Trump to be the nominee, because Trump is literally Hitler to the left, and as a result of their hysteria, it really makes that right. It makes CNN have full meltdowns that get a lot of views. It makes Fox News reacting to the wild takes of the left. It really boosts their ratings. Now, I'm not saying that means that Trump's lost. I mean, he's definitely, he's supposed to be the clear winner, at least so far, with about 4% of the vote in.
I'm seeing an update now that's saying 36% of the vote in.
Yeah, you're right. I just got that
from
too.
AP. And so, look, I mean, the margins are holding. Trump is still at 52% with 22,020 votes, with Desantis at 20.2% with 8,549, and Haley right behind him at 19.2% with 8,148, and Vivek at 7.7 with 3,259. So it looks like Trump's margin is holding with a substantial, a substantially larger influx of votes here. And I'd say, like, I didn't actually make any official predictions, but I'll go ahead and make one now. I think that Trump will probably win the primary with around 50% of the vote. And as we come out of Iowa, I think we're going to be looking at significantly, for what's left of it, is a 3-person race between Trump, DeSantis, and Haley. But I will say that for Haley, if she loses in New Hampshire as well, is she going to be willing to take a loss in her home state in South Carolina, which I think is absolutely a very real possibility, if not the likely outcome, that Trump would beat Haley in South Carolina. And so we'll see how long she stays in after this.
I have a feeling that Haley's going to stay in till at least South Carolina, because she's already made comments about how, South Carolina gets to bring it home after New Hampshire corrects Iowa. And that ticked off a lot of Iowans to hear that. But I really think that she's going to stay in as long as possible, because, again, I would really say that she's part of the Uniparty. And as someone who's part of the Uniparty, I think if nothing else, she's going to stay in to get Trump to spend as much money as possible on the primary, so that he's already at a disadvantage for the general. And we already know that Democrats have a lot more of the billionaire class on their side too. So the more money that Trump bleeds out on this primary, the worse, which is why we want this primary to be wrapped up quickly. Whether you like Trump or you like DeSantis, we ultimately, the longer this primary goes on, the worse we are in terms of being able to win in the general. So that's what I see happening with Nikki Haley. So we'll see what ends up happening. I mean, with Vivek and DeSantis, I really thought that if DeSantis doesn't win Iowa, I suspected that DeSantis was going to suspend his campaign. And, it's starting to look like that very well could be the case. He's coming in second, which is good. A lot of people were saying that he's going to lose to Haley, although Haley's really neck and neck with him right now at 19.2 for Haley, 20.2 for DeSantis. But ultimately, I think that DeSantis is going to have to really decide whether or not he wants to drop out after losing in Iowa, or whether or not he wants to, attempt to win in New Hampshire, because it really seemed like he was spending all his time and energy into winning Iowa. And if you can't win Iowa when you put 110% of your best effort, how are you going to fare in New Hampshire, South Carolina, and Super Tuesday?
Yeah, I push back there a little bit. I have a hard time seeing DeSantis drop after Iowa. Again, as we said at the beginning, the winner of Iowa is not always the person who goes on to win, just politically speaking. Again, I think it's an uphill climb everywhere. I don't think it's likely, but like, DeSantis is a fighter. He's not a quitter. And I don't, I would not expect to see him drop out, particularly if he finishes in second place in Iowa. I think he'll push on further.
Is there a scenario where someone other than Trump could get the nomination? Like, I don't see, like, I wanted to ask about, Nikki Haley bleeding Trump dry. I mean, like, I feel like if Trump is in the nominee in the general election, will there be a case to be made for him with anybody who wouldn't already be default for him? Like, could he actually, does he have the ability? And again, we're talking in 2024, which is 8 years after 2016 and 4 years after 2020. I can do math. But, is there anyone in America that's undecided on him just in principle? Like, would he, it seems to me that it's just like you just announce the two names and there's no one who would be like, yeah, I don't really know how to feel about, let's just say, Biden versus Trump. It seems like everyone in America would have already made up their mind about Trump versus essentially anyone, really. Maybe not Gavin Newsom, but like there could be some discussion to be had there. But he just seems to be one of those figures that people have already made up their mind about, for better or for worse. Probably mostly for better, but that's another discussion.
Wait, so Will, are you asking if there's a possibility that somebody other than Trump and then other than Desantis, Haley, and Vivek could be the GOP nominee?
Yeah, I guess my question is, could someone other than Trump realistically be the GOP nominee? And if Trump does end up, and then the second question is, if Trump ends up being the GOP nominee, of course there will naturally be a campaign. It's part of American culture at this point, presidential campaigns. But would the campaign actually be to change anyone's mind in any direction? Or is Trump just one of those figures that everyone has already fixed their opinion about him one way or another? Does that question that makes sense? Those questions like fit together?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think at the end of the day, when it comes to the official Republican, convention, theoretically things could happen, right?
That's
true. And not to bring up bad memories for a senator who I greatly respect, which is Mike Lee. But Mike Lee at the Republican National Convention in 2016 was part of trying to lead a little bit of an insurgent effort to displace Trump as the nominee, right? Because in this process, what these states are doing is they are the candidates are accruing electors, who then are sort of charged with the task of going and then casting those votes for the nominee at the convention. There's been crazy stuff that's happened at conventions in the past. And so, I mean, if we're talking like long shot political mayhem, yes, I guess, things could happen at the convention, depending on what's happened with all the, I would say, fraudulent, legal cases that have been brought against Trump here. I think that's obviously what the Democrats are hoping for. I mean, they're hoping that, Trump is convicted and behind federal bars, right? before we get to November, which I just have to say that the greatest third act in American presidential political history would be that we elect Donald J. Trump from federal prison, and then he gets to pardon himself and go straight to his inauguration. I mean, that would just be incredible. I'm not saying that's how I want things to go down, but if they went down that way, we would truly be living through history. And so that's, I mean, I guess you could say, in the longest odds, anything could happen at the convention, though that's highly, highly unlikely. I think the reality is Trump will be the nominee. But again, there's a lot left to see, a lot of primaries to go through. And then in terms of like whether or not people's minds are made up, well, if you go back to 2016, Trump, I think, convinced a lot of people, right? The Trump coalition, the MAGA coalition, is, there were a lot of former Democrat voters in that, blue collar voters, union voters, who in Pennsylvania, in Michigan, and Wisconsin, right, which is imperative in the path to electoral college success for a Republican president, that they win one of those states. Obviously, got to win Georgia too, and be helpful to win Arizona. And so I think Trump was one of the first, Trump was one of the first Republican and or in general, presidential candidates who was able to bring more people into his party than previously before. He won people over. Now, obviously, Clinton was, I think, a historically unlikable candidate. And Steve Bannon, was critical. If Steve's watching this, love your work, man. I think that he was critical in Trump's success in the campaign in 2016. And so there was just some real political hardball that was happening. But again, only like 50%, I might be getting my numbers wrong, less than 50% of eligible American voters vote in our, presidential elections. So if there's ability to expand the voting pool, then yes, I think you could bring people in, with media saturation painting, pictures of Trump I'm not sure if, there are people out there who can be convinced or not, but I don't think it's beyond the pale. And look, and I'd like to make another point too. 2020 during COVID, took away one of Trump's, greatest strengths in the 2016 campaign, which was his rallies, right? His ability to campaign, travel, and rally. And he's going to have that ability back unless they come up with, COVID 24 here. He's going to have that ability back, and he's going to be barnstorming around the country. And, Sleepy Joe is not going to be able to keep pace with this, which that brings in the whole consideration. And sorry to just keep waxing on here of, is it possible for any Republican presidential candidate to win again at all because of the way that election laws were so twisted, broken, and changed under COVID in key states like Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin and even Georgia, and our completely unaccountable electing system where we have massive fraud, we have illegal immigrants voting. I was in Washington, D.C., obviously not, a bastion of integrity during 2020. And my wife and I must have gotten like 10 mail-in ballots. I'm sure we could have sent them all in. We went in person.
Wish you had.
Yeah. Well, no, we went in person. So, again, it didn't matter. I was in Washington, D.C. then. There is a steep uphill climb for whoever the Republican presidential candidate is, overcoming the way that the Democrats have gamed and I would say broken the system, in their favor with ballot harvesting, mail-in ballots, and then these long, lengthy delays of counting ballots after election night. I went to bed election night 2020 thinking Trump had won. I really did. And so I'll stop there. I'll get off my soapbox.
No,
Elon
that's great.
Musk,
that's very helpful.
Elon Musk says that the most entertaining outcome is the most likely, or something to that effect. So I really think to your point, Will, I don't think anyone's going to snatch the nominee up from Trump outside of maybe DeSantis or Vivek, unless some real issues come about. That was something that Wade Stotts, when he was on the show, he was saying that he believed that there may be some tomfoolery in the primary. That was one of his predictions that he had for the new year. And I could easily see the removal of Trump from the ballots being something that ultimately ends up paving the way for Nikki Haley. I don't think that Ron DeSantis is the preferred choice from the establishment. I think it's definitely Nikki Haley. And honestly, if you've been looking at the election results tonight, she's in third only by a matter of a point away. And there's definitely been a lot of calls for Democrat voters to go out and register as Republican just to caucus for Nikki Haley. And so I don't doubt that that's where a lot of her boost is coming from tonight, because I have not met a single Nikki Haley supporter. I don't know anyone who's a Nikki Haley supporter. So I really think that that's probably a lot of what's happening right now in these primaries, because the reality is that the Democrats are not having a primary. I mean, they're not letting RFK be on the ballot in the primary, and I think they've already said there's going to be no debates. So in a way, they're paving the way for these Democrat operatives to switch parties and vote in the Republican primary, or in states that have open primaries like Tennessee, they're just going to vote in the Republican primary as well, so that they can get their establishment pick, as opposed to allowing Trump to take the nomination. Shara Joel, she's actually in Colorado. She said, "Oh yeah, Colorado is prime example of elections being stolen. Watch Rocky Mountain Heist; it will anger you." Yeah, Colorado is currently, they've kicked Trump off the ballot, and I think that it's been remedied as of right now, but it's still definitely in the courts. I am Unget over on Rumble said, "Why isn't Vivek doing better? Seems like a lot of people like him. Is his whole base Trump first?" Yes. I would say yes. His base is Trump first, and the 7 or 8% that he's currently getting, I honestly think those are a lot of more libertarian-minded candidates who don't want to vote for Trump. A lot of it because of everything that happened in 2020. They blame him for a lot of that. And William, you can give us a rundown of that later if you'd like. But I think that there's a lot of libertarian-minded people like Clint Russell, who was on the show with Will and I about a month and a half ago. He's all for Vivek. He was even telling Will and I in the podcast that he was against basically voting. He was basically against libertarians running for the GOP nominee. And coincidentally, he's actually voting for someone in the GOP race. But I think that's because Vivek is just that impressive, and he's that libertarian minded, that I think a lot of people are really liking what he's saying. But to your point, Lewis, definitely most of his base is going to be Trump first, Vivek second. So again, if Trump's taken off the ballot and Vivek's still in the race, he might be a nice safety net for us as voters. That's a lot of what he's modeling his campaign on. But of course, Trump just recently attacked him today, and or it might have been yesterday, and immediately everyone starts turning on him. That was pretty wild to see as well. So that made me wonder if Trump was not going to get above 50% until he attacked Vivek. I don't know. That's just it seemed like there was maybe some trouble in paradise with that one.
I wanted to jump in there and say thank you, William, for your analysis of the general, because I think what was behind my question that I hadn't quite fully articulated was that, if we leaving aside, the question, the whether we can actually trust free and fair elections in 2024. We'll leave that giant topic aside, and let's just pretend that we live in fantasy land where we can, just for the sake of argument. So I think my question was what I was really trying to get at, unbeknownst even to myself, was, is it actually possible to change hearts and minds towards a Trump presidency in 2024, given that we have 8 years of water under the bridge? So it's not 2016 where I think he was able to take a lot of people by surprise, or 2020 where he was running on the back of a strong economy, minus what had happened after COVID. Like, we're now 4 years into a Biden administration where, those of us with the lights on can see that, all is not right with America, but there are still so many people that haven't yet, for whatever reason, landed in that. And so, shenanigans aside, will it actually be possible? And I think you gave me the answer that yes, it will be possible to begin making inroads into different communities across America and let them know that Trump is the guy to actually turn the ship around, that it is not true that everyone in America would have already made up their mind one way or another, that minds actually can be changed to participate in this election. So I appreciate you saying that, because I guess I had sort of had this belief that surfaced in my question, obviously, that like everyone's made up their minds and like we're just going to have to roll the dice and see what happens. But it sounds like you do believe that we can get people, and even if only by expanding the the electoral base, but we can get people to change their perspective and vote in a way they wouldn't otherwise be inclined, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true. And then also the conditions on the ground in the United States of America, I do think are going to impress upon a lot of Biden voters a serious question of whether they want 4 more years of this. I mean, like the reality is you can see it, right? Like, Biden is an embarrassment to the office of president. It's arguably elder abuse. The fact that we have him in there, there's a lot of considerations that he's just a shadow, president for, Obama, who's really pulling the strings behind the scenes. And, Biden doesn't know where he is or who he is. Most of the day they drug him up and trot him out there and hope he doesn't absolutely blow it for the limited, public appearances that he gets. And then on top of that, so while Biden is totally checked out, which he is, the inmates are running the asylum, and the inmates being these radical leftists and woke individuals who are, populating every level of the federal government right now, from the White House press secretary to, just trot out the list of the dog masked general and, the guy who worked for the Department of Energy who got caught stealing women's, clothing. I mean, it's we have a man right now who pretends to be a woman as the highest ranking, medical officer in the United States of America. And so I think that there are a lot of even traditionally Democrat voting, communities and pockets in the United States of America that do recognize the insanity of what's happening under the Biden administration. They don't want to get involved in another war in the Middle East. And that's another thing too. I've had a lot of conversations with folks lately on sort of why I continue to support Donald Trump. And, the foreign policy is really big. And again, I have a particular interest in that, having worked at state and DOD, but I'll run through it like this. I have more confidence in Donald Trump than any of the other, primary candidates to, 1, keep us out of war with Russia over Ukraine, 2, keep us out of war with China over Taiwan, and 3, keep us out of another war in the Middle East with Iran. And so, not initiating, World War III is a pretty big priority in my book. And so, Yeah. So I think that when it comes to foreign policy, economic policy, I mean, people are just hurting, right? Like if you are not, already sort of living a decently comfortable financial lifestyle, through whatever you've set up for yourself, the job that you have, if you're somebody in our country who lives paycheck to paycheck, essentially, you are struggling to put gas in your car, food on your table. Maybe any savings that you were being able to accumulate have evaporated due to inflation, due to rising costs. And so I think as material conditions continue to worsen, as they will, no doubt, over the next 9 months, I think Democrats will obviously try to maybe throw whatever they can at the wall, to try to kind of make things tick up a little bit. But, there's nobody out there that thinks President Biden's doing a good job. So that's a long way of saying, I think that maybe some people, maybe some of that the Trump voters in 2016 who maybe, ticked back to Biden, maybe, Obama, Trump, Biden voters might come back to Trump. And when we're looking at the states that I was talking about earlier, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, I mean, we're talking about margins that are in the, 10,000s. Right. Yeah. Like 10,000 break one way and the state goes for Trump. I think when I looked back at the 2016 election, essentially it was 20,000 votes across Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania combined that gave those states to Trump.
And 44,000 is the margin of loss between all those states in 2020.
Yeah, that's right. And again, Will, I think it's unavoidable. We can't avoid the gorilla in the room, the 800-pound gorilla of, if they're just going to, essentially, if they have a plan in place to get the votes that they need, then, this whole conversation we're having here, guys, is meaningless.
Yeah.
And you have to wonder if the regime has this locked in by the fact that we haven't seen Biden replaced yet. Like if they think that they can win with Biden, it's because they know they control the outcome. And these are just these are the facts we have to deal with. And I'm not sure exactly what all can be done between now and election day to change those things.
Yeah. There's a lot that I wanted to say to that. First of all, one of the things that I think Trump has for him is the Grover Cleveland effect, which is Grover Cleveland. He served as the 22nd president and then the 24th president. So he's one of the only people in American history that are in a similar situation to Trump, where they were voted out of office, then came back and won the presidency. And his biggest argument was, "I told you so." And I think that that's going to be kind of Trump as well. Ultimately, I told you so. He mentioned how Biden was going to ban fracking, and of course, Biden does. He mentioned that our gas prices were going to shoot up immensely. I think he said that we'd be looking at over $5 a gallon gas in California. He said that long before the election even happened. And to your point, William, on foreign policy, that's another thing we have to remember. There was a COVID outbreak. I don't remember if it was Joe Biden. I think Joe Biden was the one that got COVID during the second debate. And so there was not a second debate in 2020. And the second debate is usually when the candidates debate about foreign policy. And to be honest, foreign policy was probably Trump's absolute strongest. No new wars, the Abraham Accords. There's a lot of great things that came out of the Trump administration, going through the demilitarized zone in North and South Korea. There's a lot of things that actually would have made Trump look very, very good. And coincidentally, they did not have that second debate that focused in on foreign policy. Now, I think it's going to be interesting to see if they even have debates. I will say the one thing that's unfortunate about Trump not debating in the primary is that kind of makes it to where his argument will be pretty weak when he argues, for Biden skipping debates or whoever ends up being the Democrat opponent. Unfortunately, that's something that he's going to have to deal with now because he's slightly made his own bed by not doing any of the primary debates. But I think that they were probably there. I'm suspicious that these presidential debates are not going to happen. That's just because of the way that they barely happened in 2020. And so many more people are awake and aware of everything going on that I really don't think that Biden can be on the debate stage for 3 debates in a row leading up to the election. That's just my thought. And then William, to kind of move our conversation away a little bit, we've been talking very specific with politics tonight, which is great. But you mentioned that ultimately, if the regime wants to sort of select their candidate, that ultimately these conversations are meaningless. And I agree with that to a point. But something that I find really interesting is we all operate in this area of Christian Twitter and Christian content creators, where there's a lot of debates on theology, Christian nationalism, is it good or bad, and a lot of these esoteric things. But it seems very rare that these people that are wanting to have these very heady conversations about how we should proceed as Christians in the public square rarely talk very specific about politics. So I'm curious why you think that is. And whether or not you think that we should be a little bit more focused on covering actual politics and the kind of the day to day, and not just philosophical arguments for why we need certain certain leadership and certain worldviews to take the leadership stage.
Connor, would you mind trying to rephrase that question for me a little bit?
Yeah. So, and I'm still gathering my thoughts here, but basically. There's a lot of people that operate in the same spaces that a lot of us are in on Twitter. There's a lot of people that are talking about Christian nationalism. They want to talk about the theology of politics.
Sure.
They want to talk about all those very specific sort of theoretical ideas, but they rarely want to get specific. So I'm curious why you think that is, that they rarely get specific. Because to me, that we have a lot of great thought leaders that never tend to know what's actually going on in terms of what's actually happening in the political realm.
Okay, let me try to give a little bit of an answer here, and then if you maybe can have some specific examples that might help me. But I'd say in general, when it comes to people who engage on Twitter, it's just really opinion-based punditry from people who have no experience whatsoever, particularly when it comes to evangelicals, right? So that that's fine. Look, if you are, say, an ethics professor at the college at the Southwestern Theological Baptist Seminary, I won't name any names there particularly, but and you've never really worked in politics a day in your life, but you've been adjacent to it in Christian spaces, then you have a lot of, opinions about things, and you'll just, pop off about it. One of the things lately I've been kind of pressing on, even with some friends, people I would consider to be friendly, who have been DeSantis supporters, has been like, have you not realized anything, or what have you learned over the last 8 years? That can you see how Trump still is the basis pick? And if you can't, you've missed the whole lesson from the last 8 years of American politics. If you don't realize why the Republican base still backs Trump, and no matter how much you prefer DeSantis with your sort of more like semi-elite and institutional leanings, the reality is he's just not the guy for the base. So I'd say lack of experience is one thing. And then just sort of like, platitudes are always easier than specific policy agendas. These guys aren't necessarily policy makers. I know that I've always tried to be like very specific when I talk about policy proposals. Again, when it comes to the issues plaguing America, the policy issues that need to be fixed they're not complicated, but they're not easy, right? I'm not saying that wrong. They're simple, but they're hard, right? Like we need to close the border and drastically reduce and we need to end illegal immigration. We need mass deportations, right? Okay, I just named a specific policy proposal that 90% of Christian political thought leaders recoil at. We need mass deportations. If you come here illegally, you have committed a felony. If or if you come here multiple times, it might be the first one's a misdemeanor, the second one's a felony. I need to brush up on my immigration law, but the bottom line is you're a criminal. You've broken the law. You would think that when we speak of justice from a biblical perspective, we want to uphold the rule of law as much as it's appropriate to do so when they're just laws. And I would argue actually the immigration laws we have on the books are fairly just. They're just not implemented. And so, when it comes to, immigration, when it comes to national security, again, we need a national security policy, a foreign policy that is, first and foremost focused on the well-being and the interests of American citizens. And that we're not allowing NATO to continue to free ride. Trump was great on that. When it comes to, transgender policies and things like that. Again, I think Trump's been great. He had a whole video on suing, hospitals and doctors who get any federal coverage, any federal funds that come to their hospitals if they are, promoting or pushing transgender ideology or performing, what so-called, gender affirmation surgeries, which is just child mutilation by a different name. I mean, I would say some evangelicals are specific on that, right? Some evangelicals are specific in supporting certain pro-life policies and certain pro-family policies. But we just don't have like the high level Christian political operators that we've had. I mean, that's part of why I'm doing what I'm doing, right? I'm sitting there in Washington, D.C. in 2016, and I'm like, Russell Moore is the guy who's speaking on behalf of all of us Baptists. This is a disaster. Like, we need better Baptist political voices in the public square. And so, the epitome or the apex of faithful Christian public official presence was Francis Collins. It's like, come on. And so we have not had, I'd say, sort of top level explicitly Protestant, seriously reform minded new right Christian figures out there. Right. So one of the things you are seeing in the conservative right or the dissident right or the new right is sort of a hearkening back to figures like Buchanan and Nixon, and I think that's something that, those guys were sort of like, anathema to the National Review style of conservatives that so many evangelicals had linked up with for so long. So, man, that's sort of a long-winded, winding answer to your question. If you had some specifics, that might help me. But I'd say in general, a lot of evangelical figures who comment on public theology and politics and ethics have little to no practical political experience. They don't know what it actually looks like or how it works in Washington, D.C. Right. And then also the ones that do are usually left-leaning. So that sort of leads a vacuum. And maybe that's why I've had at least some of the traction I've had in engaging on these issues. Yeah.
Well, I would say that's exactly why I reached out to have you on for tonight, because you're one of the few people that I see that's kind of in that overlap category where you actually talk specific politics, but then you can also stand your own in the arena of theology and talking about those more theoretical ideas that we oftentimes find ourselves completely caught up in. I mean, a more specific example would be like Dusty Deevers. It's awesome that we have Dusty Deevers in office now, but why do we not have hundreds more Dusty Deevers of, I see so many people that are talking so strongly online about how Christians need to be involved in politics, but very few of them actually want to throw their hat in the arena. And I'll be honest myself, I was seriously considering a run for state house as well. I actually called up a friend of mine who was my previous rep, and they basically said, don't do it. And the reason why they said don't do it is just because they don't think I'll be a good father during that time frame, because it's just not the season of life that I'm in. But you get guys like Dusty Deevers, and you could see why him being a bivocational pastor and now legislator, and given his age too, I believe he has older kids, and he's kind of actually ripe in terms of the stage of life to actually potentially run. So why do you think that we don't have more Dusty Deevers?
Yeah, I'll give a couple comments on that. The system has been such that people like Dusty wouldn't want to run, right? Like it's really hard. It's been hard to run and win if you're going to run like Dusty. And so it's definitely an uphill battle there. But this, I interviewed Dusty for a Twitter space shortly after his victory. And one thing that was really interesting that I didn't know that Dusty laid out was how integrally involved his church was in his decision-making process. Essentially, his church voted and charged him with running. It wasn't just like, we support you. Seriously, awesome. It's like they took this really comprehensive approach to, do we have a duty under God and to our fellow citizens to try to put somebody forward from our church for this open seat? And there was actually another individual, I think, in Dusty's church who was interested too, but the church ended up selecting Dusty and charging him to run. I haven't heard a story like that in I don't know how long, but this is what it speaks to. And I think this helps answer your question, is that the American evangelical church over the last many decades has really been subsumed by a pietistic, retreatist mentality from politics in the public square, and far from the churches sort of inculcating somebody who's going to step forward and lead and push him out as, the tip of the spear. They've just sort of like put their hands up and said, like, Jesus isn't, Jesus isn't a donkey, and he's not an elephant. He's a lamb, right? Like Jesus isn't right, he isn't left. He's the way. And so it's like this third wayism, pietism, retreatism, trot out all the isms, as really, I think, neutered. It has neutered a generation of capable Christian men who could have otherwise been charged and resourced and backed from their local congregations to get involved in the political arena at the local, state, and national level. And so instead, we just get a lot of businessmen, we get a lot of consultants, we get, sort of people who are matriculating from the Ivy Leagues and other, other dens and hives of villainy from the American, continent. So I think that's a big one, man. It's been the retreat of the churches from the political square and the public square. And again, that's also, I think, driven by the myth of neutrality, the idea that we can believe, we should believe what the Bible teaches us in our sanctuary and in our own homes. But when we go out into the public square, we've got to reason and debate on some sort of like value neutral grounds. And again, Dusty just rejects that paradigm. I trust there's a new generation of Christian men who are going to reject that paradigm as well. So I hope Dusty inspires others. And, I was sitting here thinking the other day, it's like, oh, maybe I should run for, local office, right? Yep. But I'll tie off with one more thing. If that's going to happen, there's going to need to be some sort of seismic shifts in the infrastructure around Republican politics, because the Republican Party is, again, the best vehicle, I would say, for any Christian to sort of run in. Running third party in our country these days is still just really a losing proposition. But so what we need is we need Christian and conservative financiers to sort of be able to begin pooling, PACs and dollars. And we need, media outlets who are going to be able to support, hardcore Christian candidates, because they're going to have a really hard time getting that support, from their local GOP, from their state GOP, and certainly, from the national GOP entities as well. So we need Christians who want to make some massive investments, conservatives who want to make some massive investments in funding, future political campaigns for unapologetically Christian candidates, or we're going to have a hard time getting that off the ground.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I want to jump in. You're speaking my language now, William. Thank you for that. Because one of the things that I've kind of observed is that there are lots of men that are like Christianity in America today, particularly in the Reformed faith, there seems to be some gap or chasm between idealism versus pragmatism, right? Where there are people that'll be very theologically strong, but they will lack the ability to act. And I observe in many men that they use scripture as a wall that they hide behind rather than the shield they carry in front of them. And so there's lots of debating about different theological perspectives and lots of arguments about that. It's like, guys, we have like 60 million abortions. Like, really? Like right now? Like I understand the nature of the debate, for example, between Baptists and Presbyterians. I get it. I completely get it. And guys, can we like shake hands and get something done today, please? Like, and it seems very frustrating that it's very easy for men to disappear down these rabbit holes, these denominational, theological, eschatological rabbit holes, where it's like, we have to set this aside. And there's a pragmatism gap. Like, we have to make sure the theology is right. You do not need to make sure the theology is right in order to take action, because you're never going to make sure the theology is 100% right. It's been a couple thousand years. We're still working it out. We need to get to work. And it just seems to be there's this hesitation. And I guess I would chalk it up to lack of testosterone, bad diets, fear, feminism, the idea of we don't actually know how to fight for what we believe in anymore. And that's why the Dusty Deevers example is so powerful, because he went out there into the world and went and got the job done and didn't apologize. And so I appreciate men like him charting the way, into politics specifically, where so many Christian men seem to kind of shy away. Like, my kingdom is not of this world. Like, really? I'm like that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so Yeah, I don't want to debate how many angels can dance on the head of a pin when I know how many unborn babies are being killed every year in
Right.
this country.
Right.
But I was thinking about this again. Politics is it's really so nasty. I mean, even in my, I've not run for office. I just am, a total, small fry of, a commentator on Twitter, and yet the
You're a
degree
big
of
deal to me.
the degree of hate that I've had directed my way, and like I don't talk about it a lot. David French whines all the time about all the criticism and hate mail it gets, but it's like I know that Dusty took some brutal attacks, right? And so it really impacts your family too, right? It impacts your wife, it impacts your kids, and then that gets back to whether the church structure is there to support and defend and have your back with prayer, and really be willing to stand with you. And politics, really explicit partisan politics, has become such a negative word in the American church that if say you're a capable, qualified man, say you're elder qualified, or say you're even an elder at a local church, and you decide you're going to run for office as a Republican. I mean, there are a bunch of churches out there, I think, that would essentially tell you, like, you can't do that and be an elder here, which is crazy. But they'd say that's too divisive. That's too divisive. We need to be welcoming. And so that's such a huge issue, right? Like, and I make these points and people don't like them, but I think it's true. It's like, we live in an age where I think our Christian duty compels us to be partisan. And to be clear, I'm a huge critic of the Republican Party too. But if you're going to boil it down to just, R versus D, and who's trying to drive us off a cliff at 100 miles per hour, and who's maybe at least only driving at 5 miles per hour, and is there any chance we get our hands on the steering wheel and turn this car around? That's only happening through the Republican Party as it stands today.
Yep, I agree.
I appreciated seeing you at Apologia. Must have been 3 weeks ago, something like that. I was sitting in the pews, like I saw you walk out. I'm like, I think that's. I was like 3 people deep, and you were already towards the back half of the church. I was in a conversation, but that is one of the things that I appreciate about my church, is that, like, they have a very unpopular stance on a very divisive issue, and I'm like, yes, let's go. Let's go, right? Like, no one questions where Apologia stands. Abortion criminalization. I even had a family member ask me, and I had to look into this, that like saying that like end abortion now, or my pastor advocates the death penalty for women who gets abortions. I hadn't heard that, and maybe it's true or not, but like that seems to be the word that's getting out. And so I appreciate taking that strong, principled stance into the public square. Polarize people. I think that's very necessary. And I do think that there is a resistance that Christians have towards being polarizing, maybe because of the whole winsomeness thing. But I don't remember Christians in the past, and certainly the ones that I've read in the past, did not have a problem being polarized. And many of them gave their lives over it. And, not that I'm suggesting we need to do that in this case, but certainly sacrificing our reputations, relationships with family members, careers when necessary, maybe peace in the neighborhood because someone knows that you support someone you shouldn't, or stand for something that you quote unquote shouldn't. It seems like it's about time for Christians to take these steps forward, both men and women. The hour is getting late. Yep.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The gospel is polarizing, right? The gospel message is divisive. You're either repenting of your sins and bending the knee to Christ Jesus as King and being welcomed into his family, or you are on the other side. Jesus said, I came not to bring peace on this earth, but a sword. So the gospel is divisive. However, and this is where I think that modern evangelicalism has gone so astray, the moral, ethical, and political implications of the gospel, rightly applied, are divisive as well, of the law of God applied to mankind. And I think that many evangelical leaders have, I watched this clip of Tim Keller today because American Reformer published an excellent article by Scott Polander and Brandon Myers on the decline. It was like the disastrous decay of morality in American evangelicalism. And they just provide a lot of resources and evidence and research of how leading American evangelical figures are doing things like downplaying homosexuality, upplaying unbiblical views of justice, downplaying abortion. I mean, it really comes down to the issues of sexual morality and abortion. But they wanted to only have the gospel be divisive, like only the idea that you need to repent of your sins and trust in Christ. That's the only thing that should ever be divisive. But implications of Christian morality should not be what's keeping people out of church. And that cannot be. We can't live like the world and then preach the gospel of Christ as well. We have to preach the gospel of Christ, live like Christians, and demand Christian values and standards as well. And it all goes together. And so again, that kind of ties into the gospel-centered movement that sort of took over American evangelicalism for so long, that really left off the goodness of God's law applied to our lives today.
I've got this book here, Disciplines of a Godly Man by R. Kent Hughes. It's a great book. I highly recommend it. Speaking of the decline of morality in the Christian church, there's a study that this book has in the first chapter. The discipline of purity is one of the disciplines. It's what he leads off with. 1988 in Leadership magazine, how common is pastoral indiscretion? And the question was, since you have been in local church ministry, have you ever done anything with someone not your spouse that you feel was sexually inappropriate? The responses: 23% yes, 77% no. Inappropriate was left undefined. But then when they boil it down to, have you ever had sexual intercourse with someone other than your spouse since you have been in local church ministry? Yes, 12%. No, 88%. And of that 88%, many indicated their purity had not come easily. And so you see that even within church leadership, the compromise that existed. So this was 1988. So this was now I can't do math. This is 40 years ago.
Not quite, brother. That was the year I was born. So 35.
35. I was rounding up.
Let's not round up that fast.
Let's not round up that fast. But I mean, you get a sense of like the decline of morality that it's compromised, that at least compromised many church leaders 35 years ago, 36. So almost. Yeah. So, versus, and I've got to believe that this plays a role as well, that so many pastors know, and Christians as well know that you can't go crusading into the public sphere, swinging your sword around. Like if you know that you have some indiscretions that are unresolved, pornography addiction is an enormous one as well. And so these are the sort of things that need to be addressed openly, aggressively, forcefully, so that men can get their sin wiped from their daily life and actually show up in the public square as the Christians we claim to be.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right, Will. I mean, the problem that plays into all of this is that the next generation of Christian men and just men in America are being seriously, handicapped by pornography, by passiveness, by sort of a lack of initiative. And there's nobody that's kicking them in the butt and helping them clean up their own walk with the Lord through discipleship, through the practice of the spiritual disciplines, through meaningful church membership, and sort of helping them lay the foundation of a solid character upon which they can pursue a woman, get married, have children, build a home, and then look outward. Right. I mean, and that's actually a good point too, though, is that, cultural and societal and political renewal can be brought about with and starting at home, and with a focus on stronger households, stronger marriages, pursuing, I had a chance to go back and speak at my high school a couple of years ago at graduation. And I had 4 simple points for the graduating, seniors. It was go to church in college, pursue marriage, have children, and don't be afraid to fail. Those were my 4 things. And people thought it was like the craziest thing they'd ever heard recently, But yeah, I mean, the church has left, I think, young men in the dust. That we could talk, I'm sure, for hours about the feminization of the church, but that goes hand in hand with it.
Oh yeah. It doesn't help that we have leadership too that's openly opposed to a lot of the beliefs and desires of their congregants too. Like the ERLC, for example, I mean, openly advocating for things that are completely against what most members of the SPC would even want to have brought about in terms of legislation. And so it's sad to see these weak men in positions of power while the strong men are relegated to the outskirts. They're banished to the obscure corners of the internet and not invited to the conferences. They're not invited to have positions of of importance in the institutions, and that's a lot of why we need to build new institutions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Back to Iowa, we've got 73% in, with Trump at 51.6%. So he's ticked down just a little bit, 44,616 votes. Ron DeSantis holding second position with 20.9% at 18,095. Haley right behind him at 18.8% with 16,288. Vivek staying in the 7.7, 6,665. And just Ryan Binkley's got 631. Others beating Chris Christie.
Wow.
So Chris Christie's has 25 votes at 0.03%. So, yeah, I mean, we're at 74%. So, again, like we said at the start of the show, the prediction's probably going to hold here. Again, I can understand the complaints and concerns from the DeSantis camp about how the media called it, but I think it probably didn't really change the outcome. And looks like Trump's going to take Iowa, and we'll go from here.
Yeah, it's wild. It's wild that we're already the 24 election cycle has already been launched. And Trump actually posted on Truth Social. He said, "Thank you, Iowa. I love you all. Donald J. Trump."
You're the best Iowa ever.
Best Iowa ever. Somebody would say the greatest.
Yeah. William, I actually have a question for you real quick. Maybe you can lend some political insight. Why does someone like a Chris Christie run? Like, clearly his company must, his campaign must have polling data that says you're not on the map. Why does he show up in campaign anyway? What's the purpose for candidates like that? I can understand candidates, DeSantis, Haley, making a go of it, but like, do a lot of people down ballot think that like, oh, I've really got a shot, or what's going on there?
No, not at all. Look, I mean, people like Chris Christie, or you could think back to 2016 when we had like 16 people running, right? Although that was an open year, right? We had, come off the losses of Romney and McCain, or McCain and Romney. So, I'd say that someone like Christie runs because somebody comes to him and says, "We've got some money, and we'd like you to run." It's essentially like there's a couple deep-pocketed donors out there who say Trump's a disaster, and DeSantis isn't performing as well as we expected him to. Maybe there's a lane for a centrist, maybe. So here's
a wide lane.
Yeah, a wide lane. So here's $500,000, and we'll raise you some more money. See what you can do. And for someone like Christie, it's really kind of like a no-lose proposition, right? Like, he gets his name back in the news cycle. Maybe it helps him, ink a book deal, just kind of, I mean, Christie really, I don't think loses anything of whatever stature he has in American and New Jersey politics for like running and losing again, because nobody expected him to win, really. Right. So low cost, potentially really high reward. That's obviously unrealistic. But yeah, some donor had some money and said, give it a shot. Maybe you can land some blows on Trump, but he didn't even get to debate him. Right. So it is what it is.
It's ultimately his tryout for a contributor spot on MSNBC. I mean,
something like that.
That's honestly what a lot of these guys are running for. I mean, Asa Hutchinson got absolutely destroyed by Tucker,
right,
prior to him running. It's like there's no way that these guys truly believe that they were going to win over Trump. I just think a lot of them are hoping, like you said, book deals, contributor spots, and setting themselves up for a career in media or whatever else afterwards, maybe a cabinet position if they actually are friendly with Trump. Some of them might be gunning for that, but yeah,
it's just 15 more minutes of fame.
Exactly. Well, gentlemen, usually we sign off around this time. I wasn't sure whether or not we would actually be able to. I wasn't sure if the results would be trickling in slower than this, but I mean, with 78% of the vote counted, Donald Trump's at 50.8%. If Ron DeSantis coming in at second at 21.1, I don't think that there's really much else that's going to change at this point. So we might just wrap it up there so we can all go to bed and enjoy ourselves, and maybe we'll wake up tomorrow morning and the votes will have flipped, and Ron DeSantis or Nikki Haley or someone will be the complete declared winner. But so I'll leave it to some of you internet sleuths to stay up and watch for that. But outside of that happening, I don't foresee Trump losing his lead here. So we'll go ahead and go around and sign off. But William, where can people go to keep up with you and everything that you're doing?
Yeah, a couple closing remarks. One, you can find me on Twitter at William_E_Wolfe with an E on it. And then I would like to also just leave a sort of one remark in the defense of evangelicals, voting for Trump in the primary in Iowa. I'm already seeing your standard TGC, Keller, Winsome Third Way guys demonizing evangelicals, white evangelicals in particular, for their support of Trump. It looks like 55% of white evangelicals who did voted for Trump. It's a reasonable vote. I can understand it. It's not, worshiping Trump to vote for him in a primary. It's not blasphemous. It's not, I don't think it's sinful. And so, this is one of the things that's really, revved me up over the last few years. It's just this litany and this deluge of literature, books, documentaries attacking and demonizing and vilifying white evangelical Christians because they support Donald Trump. I think it's completely reasonable, and those people are out to lunch. So there's no problem there. There's my blessing on white evangelical Trump voters. And then the last thing I'd like to say is, if you're watching this podcast and or this live stream and you are a Southern Baptist, you need to make sure to come to the annual convention in June of 2024 in Indianapolis. Southern Baptists are dealing with some very significant issues in our denomination right now, including rapid and rising egalitarianism, which is nothing really more than feminism laundered into the church in biblical language that, perverts the sanctity of the pastoral office, which God has reserved for men, not just any man, but a qualified man. Of course, that's important. So we have rising egalitarianism. We have DEI, CRT, and other forms of wokeness infiltrating the Southern Baptist Convention. And it's not just that we have a liberal drift in the Southern Baptist Convention, but there's an active and organized and funded liberal resurgence. And the Southern Baptist Convention is the largest conservative Protestant denomination in the United States. It's a critical Christian institution, and we want to see it, stand faithful on God's word and not compromise with the world. So if you're a Southern Baptist, you got to come to the convention this year. Bring all of your messengers and tell your friends. Thank you, Connor, for letting me use your podcast to get that plug in. And I'll leave it at that.
Of course. We'll definitely have to have you on as we get closer to June. Maybe we can workshop what that's going to look like. So appreciate you mentioning that. Will, where can people go to find you?
Well, this has been a joy as always, Connor. Thanks for having me on. William, it's been great to talk to you and interact with you. Thank you so much for your wisdom and perspective. If anyone wants to find out more about me, you can find me on basically every social media platform at Ren of Men. That's like Renaissance of Men, but shorter. Ren of Men. You can find more about me and what I do by going renofmen.com/links. So you got my podcast, my YouTube, my one-on-one men's coaching, and my men's groups as well. So politics is not exactly my strong suit. However, it's been a real blessing learning from you guys and getting to contribute a couple of my thoughts. And so I'm been greatly blessed by the dialogue.
Great. Well, thanks again, everyone, for listening. We really appreciate it. Join us next week. I've got Jared Moore coming on the show, talk about the lust of the flesh. So that should be a great episode. So be sure to check that out. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next time.